Okay, so today we are diving into a place that's been, well, let's be honest, a constant source of headlines, the Gaza Strip. But we're going deeper than the news cycle allows.
Deeper is definitely the right idea.
Right. Like we're talking using excerpts from the Wikipedia article on the Gaza Strip. And
Yeah.
get this, it was accessed just today.
Smart move. Things change so rapidly there. Keeping current is key.
Exactly. It's about staying updated. We're talking about a territory, think smaller than many cities, but it's home to over 2 million people.
Yeah, the population density there is mind-boggling. It shapes everything we're talking. The human experience there, the political tensions, even the potential solutions we discuss. It's crucial to start with that context.
Okay, so to really even try to wrap our heads around Gaza today, I kind of have to go back, way back, right? Talk history.
Exactly. And the story doesn't start yesterday. We got to rewind all the way back to 1948, the Arab-Israeli War,
Huge moment in the region's history.
to say the least. Imagine a mass displacement of people, many seeking refuge in Gaza, their lives completely uprooted, their homes gone.
That influx must have transformed the demographics of Gaza.
Absolutely, it set the stage for so many of the complexities we see today.
And then, just to add another layer to this, you have the Six-Day War in '67. That's when the Gaza Strip came under Israeli control, right?
Right, and that's where things get really interesting, even in terms of the language we use. You see, the term Israeli occupation, while it's widely used, it's a seriously hot-button issue. Well, you have some people who argue it's completely accurate from a legal and historical standpoint. They point to international law. They talk about the displacement of Palestinians. Then, on the flip side,
There's always another side.
always, you've got those who see it totally differently. They emphasize Israel's security concerns,
Yeah.
claiming long-standing historical ties to the land. It's a really sensitive issue.
So it's even the way we talk about it is loaded with different meanings depending on who you ask.
And that's the thing. To truly understand the dynamics at play here, we've got to understand these different perspectives.
All right, so rewind back to this already tense situation we've got. Then comes the First Intifada, and for anyone who might not know, that was a Palestinian uprising against Israeli occupation beginning in the late 1980s. And then, as if things weren't complicated enough, a few years later, the Second Intifada. These weren't just events in a history book.
Oh, absolutely not. We're talking about people's lives turned upside down.
Yeah, sure.
The effects of those intifadas are still felt today. They shaped the political landscape, they fueled distrust, and just added to this incredibly intricate situation we see in Gaza.
Then in 2005, there's this moment where it feels like maybe, just maybe, things might change. Israel withdraws its troops, they withdraw settlers from the Gaza Strip. You'd think, okay, problem solved, right? Not so fast.
Exactly. It was a huge deal, a turning point for sure. But here's the thing. It didn't really solve those core issues driving the conflict. Because while Israel physically withdrew, they kept control over Gaza's borders, its airspace, even access to essential resources. Imagine living in a place where you couldn't freely come and go, where your access to basic necessities was controlled by others. It's beyond frustrating.
So even though it wasn't occupied in the same way, it wasn't exactly free either.
Exactly. And this is a breeding ground for frustration and, in a lot of ways, continued this cycle of conflict.
Which brings us, of course, to another massive turning point. Hamas wins an election, they take control of Gaza in 2007, and this is where things get, if possible, even more complicated.
Absolutely. It's crucial to remember that Hamas is a really complex entity. Many countries consider them a terrorist organization. But at the same time, they're also a governing body, providing services to the people living in Gaza.
So it's not a clear-cut good guys, bad guys situation.
Not at all. There are internal divisions even within Hamas, and you have other Palestinian factions all operating within Gaza too.
Okay, so we've got this crazy complicated history, layers upon layers of conflict, and a population dealing with this constant uncertainty, which leads us to a term that's often used to describe Gaza, open-air prison. How accurate is that?
It's a really powerful term, and to understand it, we have to talk about the blockade. Think severely restricted movement in and out of Gaza. And it's not just theoretical. It impacts everyday life for ordinary Gazans.
So it's way more than just physical borders we're talking about here.
Right. Way more. Imagine trying to run a business when goods can't get in or out easily, or providing healthcare when supplies are scarce. Even education is impacted when students and teachers can't access resources. These restrictions have a ripple effect that's just devastating.
It's like they're caught in this system designed to restrict their every move.
And it's really important to understand why those restrictions are there. both from the perspective of those enforcing them and those living under them. Israel argues the blockade is essential for their security.
They're trying to prevent attacks.
Exactly. They view it as a way to stop Hamas from obtaining weapons, a measure of self-defense in a region that's incredibly volatile.
But then, like you said, there's the other side to that.
Always. Critics of the blockade argue that it punishes the entire population for the actions of a few, that it's basically collective punishment.
Which is where that open-air prison comparison really comes into play, because if you can't even control your own borders, it doesn't really feel like freedom, even if there are no physical bars.
Precisely. And the international community hasn't just stayed silent. They've condemned the blockade's impact on ordinary people time and time again.
Yeah.
But finding a solution, that's the million-dollar question, it's incredibly complex.
It's like a Gordian knot. Nobody wants to be the one to try and untangle it.
And tragically, every time the situation escalates, every time there's more conflict, that knot just gets tighter. The Wikipedia article talks about the 2008-2009 Gaza war, then 2014, and of course the most recent conflict that began just last year in 2023. It's a cycle that just keeps repeating.
It's devastating reading about the 2023 conflict. I mean, you see images of entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble. We're talking thousands of people killed, many of them children. And then beyond that, there's the emotional toll, the trauma of living with that constant fear, the uncertainty. It's unfathomable.
It really underscores the desperate need for a new way forward, a different approach, because what's happening now clearly isn't working. But, and this is important, before we dive into potential solutions, I want to touch on something else the Wikipedia article highlights, something that often gets overshadowed by the conflict, the resilience of the people living in Gaza.
You mean even with everything they're facing, they're still trying to live their lives?
Exactly. Gaza is more than just a conflict zone. It's a place with a rich history, a vibrant culture, people who are determined to build a future for themselves, for their children. Did you know, for example, that the literacy rate in Gaza is actually really high? Higher than some of their neighbors, including Egypt.
Wow, I had no idea, especially given everything else they're dealing with.
It speaks volumes about their desire for education, their refusal to be defined by the conflict. They have universities, schools, even a thriving art scene.
It's so easy to forget that when all we see are those images of war and destruction.
Right. It all comes back to what we were saying earlier about remembering the human experience at the heart of this. Even in the most difficult, unimaginable circumstances, humanity finds a way to shine through.
Which makes the question of Gaza's future even more poignant. Because we aren't just talking about geopolitical strategies or ceasefires, we're talking about millions of people who deserve a chance at a normal life.
Exactly. And unfortunately, the Wikipedia article doesn't offer any easy solutions. It mentions a few potential paths forward. Renewed peace talks, which have been tried before, continued cycles of violence, which is obviously not ideal, and then there are the ever-changing global dynamics that could impact the entire region.
So many possibilities, but the current path, the status quo, it's not sustainable.
You hit the nail on the head. The blockade, the violence, the humanitarian crisis, none of it is a long-term solution. It demands a much more active role from the international community, a commitment to finding a solution that works for everyone, one that addresses the security concerns of Israel, but also considers the aspirations of the Palestinian people.
It's a delicate balancing act, to say the least.
Absolutely. But what can't be debated is the human cost of this conflict. We can't, in good conscience, just sit back and ignore the plight of those caught in the middle. And that leads us to one of the more, well, let's say, interesting details from the Wikipedia article.
Yeah.
The discovery of natural gas reserves off the coast of Gaza.
Right. It's almost like this beacon of hope, a potential turning point for their economy.
But there's always a but.
It's like a double-edged sword.
Right.
We've seen how natural resources can fuel conflict just as easily as they can bring prosperity.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
It all comes down to how these resources are managed, who benefits, and if they can somehow be a source of unity instead of another reason for division.
Which takes us right back to the complexities of Gazan society. You've got different factions with different priorities, not to mention a long, troubled history of distrust.
Exactly. This incredible opportunity could just as easily become a minefield if it's not handled incredibly carefully.
Yeah, it really makes you think. You've got this place with, on the one hand, so much potential, but then on the other, so many roadblocks standing in its way. It's like a microcosm of, well, so many global challenges, isn't it?
It really is. And it highlights that there are no easy answers here. We're not talking about just signing a peace agreement or extracting some natural resources and calling it a day. It goes much deeper than that. We've got to address those underlying issues, the root causes of this conflict, the lack of trust, the economic disparities. It's a multifaceted problem.
And going back to the Wikipedia article, that's where the whole issue of Hamas's role as a governing body gets even more fascinating. Because it's not as simple as just labeling them. They're providing essential services, managing infrastructure, dealing with the daily realities of life in Gaza.
Absolutely. And that's what makes this so complex. On one side, you've got a good chunk of the international community viewing them as a terrorist organization.
Yep.
That obviously impacts everything: aid, diplomacy, the potential for any kind of international cooperation.
Yeah.
But then on the other side of that coin, you have the people of Gaza, many of whom rely on them, on Hamas, for basic necessities, for some sense of order in a situation that's anything but orderly.
So how do we even begin to untangle that? Where do you even start?
That's the million-dollar question. And honestly, if I had a simple answer, they'd probably give me a Nobel Prize. But I think a good place to start is approaching this whole thing with a sense of nuance. We have to ditch those simplistic narratives that get thrown around and really make a genuine effort to understand the perspectives of everyone involved. It's not about agreeing necessarily, but about understanding.
It's like you were saying earlier about that term Israeli occupation and how the language itself is already loaded, already comes with these preconceived notions depending on who you ask.
Exactly. And until we can at least acknowledge those different viewpoints,
Yeah.
until we can have open, honest, and respectful dialogues about what's at the heart of this conflict, finding a lasting solution that works for everyone is going to be nearly impossible.
It's a lot to wrap our heads around. I feel like we've only just dipped our toes into this incredibly complex issue.
We have, but that's what's so great about these deep dives, right?
Mm.
It's about sparking curiosity, giving our listeners the tools to go beyond those surface-level headlines, and hopefully encouraging them to dig deeper into these issues on their own.
So to everyone listening, if you're feeling a little overwhelmed by all this information, don't be. Think of this as a starting point. It's an open invitation to keep learning, keep asking questions, and most importantly, keep seeking out diverse perspectives.
I couldn't agree more. Because, let's face it, the situation in Gaza isn't static. It's constantly changing. New challenges are going to pop up, and who knows, maybe new opportunities will emerge too. It's our responsibility to stay informed, stay engaged, and keep striving for a future where things like peace and justice aren't just ideals, they're reality.
Well said. And with that, I want to thank you for taking the time to guide us through this deep dive. It's been eye-opening, to say the least.
The pleasure was all mine, truly.
And to our amazing listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey. Always remember, the world is overflowing with complicated, messy issues, but with a little curiosity, a dash of empathy, and that willingness to engage, we can start to make sense of it all. Until next time, keep diving deep.